10 American towns where you can buy a house for under $40,000. But should you? So here's a fun fact that's going to make your brain short-circuit for a second. There are places in America right now where you can buy an entire house for less than the cost of a used Honda Civic. Not a tent, not a shed, an actual house with walls and a roof and plumbing. We're talking under $40,000. In some cases, under $20,000. And before you start thinking this is some kind of off-grid homesteading situation in rural Alaska, where you have to fight bears for your mail, nope. These are real towns with grocery stores and schools and internet dots, sort of. They're just also towns where the factory closed 30 years ago. The population has been cut in half, and the crime rate makes the local news look like a true crime podcast. So the question isn't whether you can buy a house for under 40 grand in America. You absolutely can. The question is whether you should. And more importantly, what exactly you're getting yourself into if you do. Let's talk about it. Here's what's happening. America has two completely different housing markets operating at the same time, and they might as well be on different planets. In one market, you've got places like San Jose and San Francisco where the median home price is over $1 million. And people are bidding $50,000 over asking just to rent a one-bedroom apartment. In the other market, you've got entire Rust Belt cities where homes are selling for the price of a semester of out-of-state tuition. And the gap between these markets isn't closing. It's getting wider. Because the cheap markets aren't cheap because they're hidden gems waiting to be discovered. They're cheap because something went catastrophically wrong, and it never got fixed. We're talking about towns that lost their major employer in the 1980s or 90s. Steel mills that shut down. Auto plants that moved to Mexico. Coal mines that went bust. When those industries collapsed, the tax base collapsed with them. Schools got worse. Infrastructure started falling apart. Crime went up. And everyone who could afford to leave left. What's left behind are the people who couldn't move or didn't want to, and a whole lot of empty houses. And when you have way more houses than people who want to live in them, prices crater. Supply and demand in its most brutal form. So yes, you can buy a house in some of these places for $30,000 or $40,000. But you're not buying into a housing market. You're buying into the aftermath of economic collapse. And that comes with some very specific trade-offs that real estate listings don't exactly advertise. Let me walk you through 10 places where this is happening right now. And I'm going to be very honest about what you're actually getting for that bargain basement price. Number 10, Muncie. Indiana Muncie is what happens when a town's entire identity is built around one thing, and that thing goes away. For decades, Muncie was a General Motors town. Ball State University is there, which helps, but when GM started closing plants in the area, Muncie's economic foundation just crumbled. You can find houses here in the $20,000 to $40,000 range without much trouble. The median home price hovers around $60,000 to $70,000. But if you're willing to buy something that needs work, or if you're looking in the rougher neighborhoods, you can go way lower. The catch is Muncie has all the problems you'd expect from a post-industrial Midwest town. The poverty rate is over 30%. The crime rate is higher than the Indiana average. And the job market is basically the university, healthcare, and not much else. If you don't have remote work or a reason to be there, you're going to struggle. But here's the thing. If you're a student or you work at Ball State, Muncie actually makes sense. Cheap rent, cheap housing, low cost of living. It's not glamorous, but it's functional. Just don't move there expecting some kind of urban renaissance. That ship sailed 20 years ago. Number 9, Saginaw. Michigan Saginaw is another Michigan Rust Belt casualty, and it's one of the cheapest housing markets in the entire state. Median home prices sit around $40,000 to $50,000, and you can definitely find properties in the 20s if you're okay with fixer-uppers. Saginaw used to be a major automotive and manufacturing hub. When those industries started declining in the 70s and 80s, the city never really recovered. The population peaked at over 90,000 in 1960 and has been falling ever since. It's under 50,000 now. The problem with Saginaw is the same problem with a lot of these towns: high crime, high poverty, limited job opportunities. The unemployment rate tends to run higher than the state average. and a significant chunk of the population lives below the poverty line. Schools are struggling. Infrastructure is aging. If you're buying in Saginaw, you're buying because you need cheap housing and you have a specific reason to be there. Maybe you have family in the area. Maybe you work remotely and you just need a roof over your head. But you're not buying because Saginaw is about to turn around. It might. Stranger things have happened, but I wouldn't bet my life savings on it. Number 8. Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown is basically the textbook example of what happens when an entire regional economy is built on steel and then the steel industry collapses. In the 1970s and 80s, Youngstown lost something like 40,000 jobs when the steel mills started shutting down. The population has been hemorrhaging ever since. Median home prices in Youngstown are in the $60,000 to $70,000 range, but you can find houses in the 20s and 30s without much effort. Some properties sell for under $10,000, though at that price point you're usually looking at something that's been sitting vacant for years and needs massive amounts of work. Youngstown has been trying to reinvent itself for decades. There's Youngstown State University, which provides some stability. There have been attempts to attract tech companies and diversify the economy. But the reality is Youngstown is still dealing with the aftermath of losing its economic foundation 50 years ago. Crime is a real issue here. Poverty is high. The tax base is weak, which means the city struggles to fund basic services. If you're thinking about buying in Youngstown, do it with your eyes open. This is a place where you're trading extremely low housing costs for basically every other quality of life metric being below average. Number 7. Camden, New Jersey. Camden is famously one of the poorest and most dangerous cities in America, and the housing prices reflect that reality. You can find houses here for under $40,000, sometimes well under. Camden's problems are deep and systemic. The city has dealt with decades of industrial decline, population loss, and extreme poverty. The crime rate is astronomical. The schools are among the worst in the state. The unemployment rate is consistently higher than both the state and national averages. There have been some revitalization efforts, mostly concentrated around the waterfront in areas near Philadelphia. Cooper University Hospital and Campbell's Soup Company are major employers. But for most of Camden, the situation remains grim. If you're considering Camden, you need to understand that you're not just buying a cheap house. You're buying into an environment where safety, schools, and basic city services are all going to be below what you'd expect in a functional municipality. It's cheap for a reason. Number 6. Baltimore, certain neighborhoods. Baltimore is a complicated market because it's a real city with actual economic activity, but it also has neighborhoods that have been completely abandoned. You can find row homes in East Baltimore, West Baltimore, and other distressed areas for under $50,000, sometimes under $20,000. The catch is these properties are usually in neighborhoods with extreme poverty and crime. We're talking about areas where the vacant housing rate is over 20%, where boarded-up buildings are more common than occupied ones, where drug activity is rampant and violent crime is a daily reality. Baltimore has been trying to address this for years with various redevelopment programs, but progress is slow and uneven. Some neighborhoods have stabilized, others continue to decline. If you're buying in one of these ultra-cheap areas, you're essentially betting on a turnaround that may or may not happen in your lifetime. The other thing about Baltimore is the property taxes. Maryland has relatively high property taxes, and Baltimore city taxes are even higher. So even if you buy a house for $30,000, you're still going to be paying $1,000 plus a year in property taxes, plus insurance, plus maintenance on what is almost certainly an old building that needs work. Number 5. Cleveland, certain neighborhoods. Cleveland's median home price is around $120,000 for the metro area, but that number is massively skewed by the suburbs in certain parts of Cleveland proper. Especially on the east side, you can find houses for under $40,000. These are usually older homes in neighborhoods that have experienced significant population loss and disinvestment, high crime, high poverty, weak schools, limited access to services. The same pattern we've seen everywhere else on this list. Cleveland as a whole has actually been making progress. Downtown has seen some revitalization. There are pockets of gentrification. The city has been trying to attract young professionals and remote workers with relatively affordable housing compared to coastal cities. But that progress hasn't reached every neighborhood, and the ultra-cheap areas are cheap for very specific reasons. If you're looking at Cleveland, the smart play is probably to spend a little more and get into a transitional neighborhood, rather than going for the absolute cheapest option. An extra $20,000 or $30,000 can make a huge difference in terms of safety and quality of life. Number 4. Flint. Michigan. Flint is forever going to be known for the water crisis, and that legacy has absolutely destroyed the housing market. Median home prices are around $53,000 as of 2026, which is up from the absolute bottom they hit during the crisis, but still insanely cheap for a city of Flint's size. The water situation has technically been fixed. The lead pipes have been replaced. The water tests within acceptable limits, but the trust is gone. A lot of people still won't drink the tap water, even though it's supposedly safe. And the broader economic problems that existed before the water crisis are still there. Flint lost most of its auto manufacturing jobs decades ago. The population has been cut in half since its peak in 1960. Poverty is high, unemployment is high, crime is still an issue even though it's improved from its worst years. The school system is struggling. You can buy a house in Flint for $30,000 or $40,000, and some people do. But you're buying into a city that's still dealing with massive trauma and economic decline. It might turn around eventually. There are people working hard to make that happen, but it's going to take time, and there are no guarantees. Number 3. Gary, Indiana. Gary might be the most infamous town on this list. It's become a symbol of industrial collapse and urban decay, and honestly, that reputation is mostly deserved. Gary was built by U.S. Steel in the early 1900s, and for decades it was a booming industrial city. At its peak in 1960, Gary had over 180,000 people. Now it's down to around 68,000, and the population is still shrinking. Median home prices are in the $35,000 to $40,000 range, with plenty of properties available for less. The crime statistics in Gary are genuinely shocking. The crime rate is 30 per 1,000 residents, which means you have a 1 in 30 chance of being a victim of crime in a given year. Violent crime is one of the highest rates in the nation. The unemployment rate is over 13%. The poverty rate is almost 33%. Gary has been trying to reinvent itself for years. There are occasional development projects, efforts to attract new businesses, initiatives to demolish vacant buildings and clean up abandoned properties. But the scale of the problem is just overwhelming. Thousands of vacant structures, entire neighborhoods that are basically ghost towns. If you buy in Gary, you need to understand what you're getting into. This is not a fixer-upper situation where you put in some sweat equity and everything's fine. This is buying into one of the most economically distressed cities in America and hoping things eventually get better. Number 2. Detroit. Certain neighborhoods. Detroit is weird because it's both a legitimate housing market with real economic activity and also home to some of the cheapest residential real estate in the country. The city average is around 78,000 according to Zillow, but that number hides massive variation. In downtown Detroit, Midtown, Corktown, and other revitalized areas, home prices are actually relatively normal. You're looking at $200,000 plus for anything decent. But on the east side, in neighborhoods that have been abandoned, you can still find houses for under $40,000. Some sell for under $10,000. The catch with Detroit is you're basically buying into a neighborhood lottery. Some areas have stabilized and are even gentrifying. Others are still in free fall. If you buy in the wrong neighborhood, you might find yourself surrounded by vacant lots and abandoned houses with no city services and sky-high crime. Detroit has been slowly recovering from its bankruptcy and decades of decline, but that recovery is extremely uneven. If you're thinking about buying there, you need to do serious research on the specific neighborhood you're considering. A few blocks can make the difference between a viable investment and a complete disaster. Number 1. East St. Louis, Illinois. East St. Louis is the cheapest market on this list, and it's cheap for all the worst reasons. The median home value is $38,000. Median household income is $31,000. The unemployment rate is over 15%. The poverty rate is almost 33%. But the real issue is crime, East St. Louis consistently ranks as one of the most dangerous cities in America. The crime rate is over 66 per 1,000 residents. You have a 1 in 30 chance of being a crime victim annually. The violent crime rate is off the charts. Schools are among the worst in the state, East St. Louis has been economically devastated for decades. It used to be a major industrial and railroad hub, but when those industries collapsed, the city never recovered. The population has fallen from over 80,000 in 1950 to under 20,000 now. There's almost no reason to buy in East St. Louis unless you have very specific circumstances. Maybe you have family there and you want to be close. Maybe you're part of some kind of community revitalization effort. But as a pure housing investment or a place to live, it's one of the riskiest bets you could make. The houses are cheap because almost nobody wants to live there, and nobody wants to live there because the conditions are genuinely terrible. That's not me being mean. That's just the reality of what happens when a city loses its economic base and can't recover. So what's the bigger picture here? These ultra-cheap housing markets exist because we have entire regions of the country that never recovered from deindustrialization. The Rust Belt got absolutely demolished in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s when manufacturing moved overseas or automated. And while some cities managed to reinvent themselves, a lot didn't. The places that are still struggling tend to have a few things in common. They were too dependent on one industry. They didn't have the resources or the leadership to successfully transition to a new economic base. They lost population, which meant they lost tax revenue, which meant they couldn't maintain infrastructure or schools, which made more people leave. It's a vicious cycle. According to census data, many of these cities have lost 50% or more of their peak population. That's not a recession. That's a regional economic collapse. And when you lose that many people, housing prices crater because there's just way more supply than demand. Here's what you need to understand if you're actually considering buying in one of these markets. First, buying a house for $30,000 or $40,000 sounds great until you factor in everything else. Property taxes in distressed cities are often still relatively high because the city is desperate for revenue. Insurance can be expensive because of crime and the age of the housing stock. Maintenance costs are going to be high because these are old houses that have often been sitting vacant or poorly maintained. Second, you're not just buying a house. You're buying into a community, and in most of these cases, that community is struggling badly. High crime means you need to think seriously about safety. Bad schools mean if you have kids, you're either paying for private school or dealing with a failing public system. Limited job opportunities mean if you lose your remote job, you're in trouble. Third, these markets could stay cheap indefinitely. There's this assumption that everything eventually rebounds, but that's not actually true. Some places decline and never recover. The idea that you can buy low and wait for gentrification is gambling, not investing. That said, there are scenarios where buying ultra-cheap housing makes sense. If you have guaranteed remote income and you just need a place to exist while you save money. If you're retiring and your expenses are minimal and you don't care about amenities. If you're part of a community land trust or intentional effort to stabilize a neighborhood. If you're buying with cash and you understand you might never be able to sell. The existence of $40,000 houses in America isn't an opportunity. It's a symptom. It's what happens when entire communities get left behind by economic change and nobody figures out how to fix it. These aren't hidden gems. They're not undervalued markets waiting to explode. They're the leftovers of industrial collapse, places where the jobs disappeared and never came back, where the people who could leave did. And what's left is a drastically shrunken population trying to keep things together with a fraction of the resources they used to have. Can you buy a house in one of these places for less than the cost of a used car? Absolutely. Should you? That depends entirely on your situation, your risk tolerance, and whether you have any other options. Just don't confuse cheap with affordable. Cheap means the price is low. Affordable means you can actually make it work without destroying your quality of life. And in a lot of these towns, those two things are very different. So here's my question for you. If you could buy a house for $30,000, but it meant living in one of these towns, would you do it? Or is there a minimum quality of life threshold that no amount of cheap housing is worth crossing? Let me know in the comments. And if you know someone who's been looking at these ultra-cheap markets and thinking it's some kind of housing hack, send them this video. They need to know what they're actually getting into. Subscribe if you want more brutally honest real estate intelligence. I'll see you in the next one.